I think there's argument to have really strong boundaries around the screen time, and that's in the form of parental controls and that kind of stuff. But I think it's more than that, and it's about family values. And the tricky part is living by that as an adult as well. If you have the no screens at the table rule, which we do, sometimes it's the kids saying, "Mum, phone away," and I say, "Oh yeah, okay." So you have to really embody the values rather than just being really strict about the rules, I think.
Welcome to the ADHD Families Podcast. I'm your host, Sharon Collin, an award-winning credentialed ADHD coach and consultant and mama and wife to a very ADHD family. I am seriously obsessed with making life easier for people with ADHD and those that support them. My business, The Functional Family, provides life-changing support and strategies for ADHD. I particularly love anything that saves time, decreases conflict, and creates space for fun. Do you want a life with your beautiful family that is more functional, fun, and full of joy? Let's explore together the wonderful and sometimes wacky world of family life with ADHD in the mix. Welcome to another episode of the ADHD Families Podcast. I am so happy that you are here. Today we are chatting about teenagers and ADHD, and I know that a lot of you are really curious about this topic. You might have some teenagers pending, or like me, you have teenagers yourself. And we know that adding ADHD in the mix when we're going through the normal teenage changes can add a whole new level of intensity. So I have got in a guest expert, the incredible Leanne Tran, who's a registered psychologist who specialises in helping families and teens with ADHD. So in this episode, we chat about, what is the standard teenage behaviour and what happens when we add ADHD in the mix and how to spot the difference. We talk about executive functions. We talk about homework, high schools, homework. How much should we be worried about this, and how much pressure should we be applying for our teenagers with ADHD? We also talk about trigger warning for those that need it, self-harm and suicide, because we know that these are big topics in this age bracket. And then we talk about connection, unconditional regard, and screen time. I can't wait to share this one with you. Let's get to it. Welcome, Leanne. I am so happy to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you so much. You've got such a lovely energy. I feel very welcomed.
I think this episode is going to really, really resonate with our listeners. But before I get carried away with all my questions, can you tell me a little bit about who you are, what you do, and why you do it?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Leanne Tran. I'm a psychologist who has worked with children and their families for about 20 years or so. And they've always been children developing differently. So whether neurodevelopmentally different or physical disabilities or learning challenges. And I think I always wanted to be a teacher when I was in high school. And I think that shifted through into the work I do now, where it's what I really love is teaching kids about themselves and families about their children. And what's drawn me lately to ADHD is some diagnoses in my family that's helped me niche down on that a little bit and just really think about the practical strategies that work day to day for busy families.
Love that so much. You are absolutely on the right podcast for
a
summary like that. So you got into it because you had some diagnosis in your family. And is that what sparked the passion for ADHD, like for consuming that ADHD content? Have you always been in this area?
I've always worked in this area, but I think it's particularly around the teenage years that's helped me, because I guess a lot of the work I do was with younger kids, much like the awesome work that you do. But in my clinic one-on-one, it's with younger kids. But I found too often that kids are being diagnosed later and later now. But because I should have mentioned, actually, to give context, a psychologist seeing people in private practice one-on-one. So, and I found often, even if kids were teenagers, I'm talking about teenagers with ADHD, they were coming a lot with not a lot of information. And so maybe in some ways they'd missed that experience in the process. So it was kind of this combination of seeing more teenagers at that point of diagnosis, but also seeing families who had had the diagnosis for a few years but missed that information. And then also myself and my own family thinking about strategies for teenagers, particularly because their brains work differently to little kids. So that's what sparked the passion to adapt or think more strategically about the strategies I was giving for that teenage group.
Okay, I've got so many questions. So
Okay.
I'm just going to organize them in my brain.
Yep.
So firstly, I would love to ask how people, how families or how teenagers present to you in clinic. What are the things that they're saying?
It's interesting. Some families say things like, I knew my child had ADHD right from the beginning. So when they were babies or when they were little. And sometimes in that context, they're saying, we managed a lot of things okay until now. And maybe it's when those demands from high school have increased and families are becoming, or the kids kind of being put under pressure, and that puts the family under pressure. Sometimes in some cases that's caused kids to have real difficulty with going to school, or sometimes challenges from ADHD throughout childhood has then kind of led to impacts on schooling and school achievement over the time, or even development of things like anxiety and that kind of stuff. So often seeing teenagers with ADHD, but also those other challenges as well, because as time goes on, I think, it varies family to family. Sometimes the ADHD is supported differently. Sometimes it's easy. Sometimes it's not easy to support an ADHD child. And so when it's not, sometimes these secondary things come along.
Mm. So I think a lot of parents, when we get to this age group of teenage, we've got teenagers in the household, parents have a lot of trouble deciphering what is an ADHD behavior, like symptom, and what is normal teenage behaviors, pushing boundaries, those sorts of things. Do you have any advice for parents that are questioning that, asking for a friend?
Aren't we all asking for friends? I think it's really tricky to say, and have just done a webinar on this exact topic last month about trying to tell the difference between those ADHD type behaviors and, other challenging behavior. What I offered I don't know if it really answers the question or not, but my perspective is that if you understand your teen's executive functioning capacities so that you've got the right expectations, and then you have support in the moment where they need it. So that's, for example, lists and all the visual schedules and that kind of stuff. If you've got the right expectations and support and it's still happening, it may be more along the lines of that challenging behavior. This is for the day-to-day stuff in terms of being organized and all of that kind of stuff. But I think what is useful to expect for teenage kids is that even typically developing teenagers will have more bouts of that just really irrational decision making. And so because as teenagers are developing, they're kind of developing, they've got that real drive to be independent and that kind of thing. And then their emotional processing or thinking and problem solving kicks in after that. So it's often, times when they do really silly stuff that they can't explain, which is very similar sometimes in ADHD. So there's more likely that kind of stuff in teenage years anyway. So there's probably going to be a lot more of those times when it's just unexplained stuff. And recently I read a book that was saying that if it's varied, sorry, not varied, that's not the right word. If it's sporadic, like occasional, those blips of problem solving seems typical. Yeah, but if it's happening a lot daily, then it's probably more related to ADHD, I'd say.
That can be a very tricky one for parents to navigate. And
Yeah.
I think when it gets to this age group, we start to mentally, like, even though we know we probably shouldn't because of the developmental delay, but we start to expect more. So perhaps in the younger years, we do a lot of our children's executive functions for them.
Mm-hmm.
We support them through all that stuff. And then it gets to the age and they're bigger and we start to think they should be able to, why can't they? I hate those words. But, it's quite natural for parents to actually believe that their children should get their level of their peers.
Yeah.
So it can be a really tricky thing to navigate because our kids are just not quite there yet. Like they're still 30%, there's still that 30% delay going on.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. And I think some of the changes in societal culture around teenagers impacts that as well, because, a couple of generations ago, we'd still see teenagers as more like kids who aren't really responsible. But in this day and age, some of the trends seem to show that we hold teenagers to adult standards when they are still developing. So just generally expectations of parents can be too high of teenagers. So it is a really important thing to reconsider.
I often think, and this is a little detour now, but with our kids having so much access to YouTube and tutorials and everything like that, I sometimes think it's a bit sad that they can be instant, like they can research everything straight away. Like for an example, like thinking back to perhaps mine and your childhood, like we didn't have, like if we wanted to know something, we had to kind of research it. And we also weren't the experts at everything. I mean, I don't know about you, but the first time I put on makeup, I was like learning it from a Dolly magazine and it was terrible.
Yep.
But when our kids today can like be instant makeup experts, right? Because they're watching video tutorials and they're, learning things so quickly and so rapidly, they're not getting those, like that space in between things. They're not going through different stages. Like we had grunge stage and like all different stages of, of culture, but they're not seeming to go through that. They look so put together and so adult these days.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. I think that definitely shifts our perspective because they seem outwardly very competent, even if, like you say, it's about the physical looks, like through makeup or even fashion, but also that idea that if they're not sure about something, they can Google it and they can find out, or they can find out how to do something. So they can appear really worldly or confident and competent, but it's their emotional maturity is, not at that same level.
So that leads me to a question about screen time. Now, do you have a few, where do you sit on screen time? What's your feeling about that for our beautiful parents with teenagers that, probably glued to their phone right now?
It is the challenge of our generation, I think. And interestingly, one book I read was about like guiding our children with the knowledge we have now, but that each generation's job is to take that knowledge and then their own experience and learning and build on that to solve the problem. So I think in some ways it's going to have to be a problem that this generation of teenagers solves as they move through the world, because, we we haven't lived through it to be able to problem solve it. But I think also it ranges so much from just problematic, screen time in terms of not wanting to turn it off and go and have a shower, right through to not going to school. So I think screen time is shown to be good for social interaction and skills for teenagers particularly. So I think that's something in its favour, which means that it is probably good to let your kids have some. But also I think it's just inevitable. They use laptops at school often and all of that kind of stuff. So to try to fight it too much is a bit of a losing battle. Mm-hmm. I think there's argument to have really strong boundaries around the screen time. And that's in the form of parental controls and that kind of stuff. But I think it's more than that, and it's about family values. And the tricky part is living by that as an adult as well. If you have the no screens at the table rule, which we do, sometimes it's the kids saying, "Mum, phone away." And I say, "Oh yeah, okay." So you have to really embody the values rather than just being really strict about the rules, I think. I also try and always use it as a reward at the end for things. So, for example, if I know for some kids it's kind of regulating and calming to use it after school, but I find it's always really tricky to then stop that enjoyable activity to move on to something else that's less enjoyable. So I always try to suggest using something else to regulate if you need to at the beginning of a transition, doing all of the jobs or the work, and then the fun at the end is what my kids will probably put on my tombstone. Jobs and then fun. Yeah. But then if it's hedging over to the other side where kids don't want to stop, if it's impacting their sleep or impacting them going to school, it's no good. And you've got to do something about it, because those are the kinds of things that do snowball into bigger and bigger problems.
I think it's such a big topic for families, that are handling this, because a lot of the time we're just so outmatched with tech. Like, I have no idea what's going on. And inside the membership, we did a wonderful child safety police officer came in and talked to us about tech and like how to protect our kids from being online groomed and sextortion and all that sort of stuff. And I was so blown away by how much I didn't know. I was like, oh my goodness, I didn't even know about that sextortion thing. I didn't know about it. So, it's really great for parents to have these conversations with our kids and give them, that open dialogue and a bit of autonomy about it, so they can go make good choices, hopefully, with us and us setting the example. Just like you said, like if we're going to ask our kids not to have a phone at the table, then we shouldn't have phones at the table.
Yeah, that's right.
It is hard.
And I think, one last point is that negotiating should be part of it as well, because when kids are little, we can maybe be a bit more in charge of putting in the boundaries. But if you want your child to adhere to the boundary, they've got to agree to it, because you just can't force them not to. You shouldn't force any kids, but just as they grow older and they're more looking towards becoming independent and making their own choices, what you think is a little bit less powerful to them. So you've got to kind of sit down together and work out what's an acceptable solution for you and for them in terms of managing all the screen time.
Love that. Great advice. Our kids hate being told what to do. They hate it.
Yep.
So it's good to collaborate. Ask them, like, what is an acceptable amount of time? Like, what do you think that you can do whilst also doing what you need to do for sport and all that sort of thing. Now, Can I ask a question about homework? So for teenagers specifically, because I know this is your area, and I mean, a lot of parents have expectations about how much homework, keeping up with school and all that sort of stuff. And I think our listeners would know that I do not have such expectations. Like, I don't mind. For homework and school, my only goal for school for my boys is to get them through it. We don't stress about those sorts of things. But I know a lot of parents have a lot of internal turmoil about that. And a lot of battles are being had with their, beautiful teenagers about how much homework, expectations. Do you have any tips for gorgeous parents about homework and managing that load?
I do. It's a little bit of a fraught topic, isn't it? Because people have different expectations and that kind of thing. But I guess as a psychologist, seeing lots and lots of kids come through with various different challenges, my goal always is for kids to just go to school and be well-adjusted, happy humans. And I think if you are doing that, you're winning. So, and I know schools have expectations about homework, and if it's something for you as a family that you want to do, I think just the bare minimum is enough. I think there are some suggestions that can make it easier. And so for teenagers to get their homework done, particularly ADHD teenagers, if you've got one that rises early, because some kids still do, doing it in the morning is better than slogging it out in the afternoon. And so doing it early on the weekends as well, not early, like 6, but, in the morning is going to make it far less frustrating. Anything you can do to make it simpler, more fun and engaging is going to be less of a battle. So whether that's doing it in the morning or not. My child also uses that motivation is a strong factor. He needs that external motivation. And so interestingly, has never struggled with the academics of it, but always has said, Mum, can you help me with my homework? And I say, how? And he says, to motivate me to do it. That's how he asks for help. So we use a lot of breaking it down and doing each bit. And those mini packets of Skittles work really well. So each little section, he'll have a Skittle and, that's for him what works. The thing that I would keep top of mind in thinking about this homework thing is that one of the biggest traps I think we can fall into with parenting ADHD kids is getting into this battle of wills. And the reason for that is what happens if you try and assert your will, and so do your kids, you gradually escalate, they escalate, and it gets to a point where then somebody just walks away or gives in. And that really sets up a pattern for our kids that if they push hard enough, they can just, the problem will go away. And it's definitely not intentional, but that's kind of that pattern that then can keep repeating. So I think if I would rather forego any expectation of homework than to be in that battle of wills all the time. And I think that's it becomes more important as kids grow older as well, because they are more responsible for their choices. And if we protect them from the consequences of their choices as well, then they never will be independent in doing it. So I think it's much more beneficial to kind of manage emotions and get through the basics well and feeling good than to add on extra pieces of work.
Yes. So much of what you just said there was absolute gold.
That's good.
Yeah, that was really wonderful. So let's take it to a darker place now. So trigger warning for people that are listening. A lot of teenagers, and I'm sure you would have had a lot of experience with this, and this is definitely out of my realm, so I wanted to ask you about it. We're talking self-harm, suicide for ADHD. We know that it's an increased risk. So can you maybe provide some wisdom around those topics? Because I know that parents are struggling with this, to give them a few tips about what they can do if this is what their teenager is showing some concerning behaviours.
Yeah, sure. To start with, I guess, if like with younger kids, if you're aware of the challenges of ADHD and trying to put things in place to support that, then your chances of developing these secondary challenges are a lot reduced. So that's a really positive thing to think about and focus on. The way I see it too with the self-harm is that it kind of ties into that difficulty with regulation and regulation of emotions that teenagers have. So I think it's something that's really scary for parents. But if you see it more so as a way that they are trying to handle really big feelings, it can take a little bit of that fear out of it. And that can help you have a conversation with your kids about what's going on. And what you might want to understand is what they're feeling and what they're stressed by. It's likely to be friendship issues, school pressures, perhaps even possibly some pressures from home as well. Sometimes kids feel pressure that we don't mean to put on them, sometimes it's as simple as other things going on in your life that's just putting extra pressure on them. But if you can talk to your kids about that in this really open way of saying, I heard that lots of kids do this as a way to kind of manage these big feelings and stress. Is that something that you identify with or that kind of thing? Then they can talk to you about it a lot more. If you're taking your kids to go and see a psychologist, how we would usually approach it is to validate that self-harm is one way of managing stress, but there are lots of other ways, and we can help you learn a lot of other ways as well. So that it's kids, first of all, develop a way of talking about their emotions and understanding how they feel. Then they've got a range of different options to deal with them. And self-harm is just one of those things. And so likely they will try and use some other things that will be successful as well. So if that is something you want to try as a parent, you can definitely do that. You could recommend some alternatives, which could be, some other things that manage feelings really well, or like tolerate that distress of feeling upset, like holding onto ice in your hands for ages, splashing your face with incredibly cold water or icy cold water can give that same kind of feeling. So it can be something that you could teach your child to do and see if that helps them or not as well. Because it's kind of about learning how to manage the distress of those difficult feelings. So if you have open communication about that and say, are there other things you can do? Can I help you? Maybe it's having a warm cup of tea or a cold drink or sitting in the sun for a few minutes. Lots of other things you can offer as alternative ways to tolerate that distress so that self-harm doesn't remain their only option. I guess that's the goal.
When I did the Lifeline course, they, were saying that it's okay to say the word suicide. It's okay to say the word self-harm. Like you don't, I think parents scoot around it. They don't want to say the word. Like they're already thinking about it. If you're having that conversation, you can actually say the word. It's not going to make them do anything. It's,
exactly.
It's okay to have those real conversations, which I thought was a very great point to just add in there too. Like it's okay to talk about these things with our kids.
Yeah, that is a really good point, because I think it's often our fear as parents that hold us back from having those real conversations. And you can know that if your teenager is engaging in self-harm, whether that's cutting themselves or that kind of thing, they've already thought about it because they've already done it. So for even you to say, like, I've noticed that sometimes when this happens, like, I wonder, you've been cutting yourself or something like that, you can name it. They've already been thinking about it because they've already done it. And the same's true for suicide as well. And I think the worry parents have a lot is if they say it, they might be putting that thought into their child's head, but nobody can really do that. So if your child has attempted suicide or if they have thoughts about suicide, that is not because they've heard it from, somewhere else or from you. You can't put that feeling into them. But by naming it, sometimes it makes it so much easier for our teenagers to actually talk about it themselves.
Such a good point. Now,
sorry, before you go on, I know you mentioned suicide a little bit, so I did want to talk about that a little bit as well. And I think that's a time when it's really great to go and get some help. You mentioned Lifeline, and there are lots of places that you might be able to see a psychologist or mental health social worker or OT as well. Lots of people around who can help with that. But I think that's a time when you need to get some help into your team, because then they can teach you how to talk about it and deal with it. And then you might be able to manage on your own. But I think it just gives parents that real confidence of knowing they've talked to somebody about it who can help with assessing the risk. Psychologists will then usually do a safety plan and talk about that with parents, so that then you've got some strategies to, first of all, know the triggers about what kind of sets this type of thinking off, so that you can be aware of the triggers, and then you've got a plan about what to do to help your teen. Sometimes the triggers will be things that they are feeling or experiencing that you can't see, but sometimes there will be triggers that you do see, like maybe they spend more time in their room or they stop going out with their friends. And being aware of those kind of signs can help you feel confident as a parent of when you need to step in.
Oh, that is such good information. What I wanted to chat to you about is leading on from that. we know I throw around the term unconditional regard a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
And trying to stress to parents how important connection is for beautiful kids with ADHD. It overrides every strategy, everything, all the time.
Yep.
Can you give us your view on unconditional regard and how important you think it is?
Yeah, I'm with you there. It's the most important thing. I think it leads into that like attachment relationship with our kids is unconditional positive regard. Your audience probably is all aware of what it is if you talk about it a lot, but it's essentially always feeling or appearing positive about your child and regarding them positively. I think it's so important when kids are little, but even more so when they're teenagers, that good attachment relationship and that secure bond we have with our kids is really what helps them feel safe in that relationship with us. And it lets them be able to explore who they are and what they want to be within that knowledge that we've got them, we love them forever. And in teenage years, that's when a lot of that exploration about identity and stuff like that happens. And so kids might be in terms of their appearance or their hairdo, like I'm thinking mullets and crocs and that kind of stuff. So being unconditionally supportive of all of those choices is great because it lets our kids kind of have the confidence to try out who they're going to be until they decide. But in teenage years, I think it's harder sometimes to give that unconditional positive regard because they often don't give it to us. Because teenagers can be so harsh. So it's really about I practice this myself, like taking this big breath after they've said something that's cutting or something like that, and try to remember that they're this person who's kind of stuck between being a kid and an adult, and they're trying to find their way. Yeah, you got to have a thick skin, I think.
One of the things that I, just talking to that is I always try and say to my teenager, like I always try and say, like, I've got your back, buddy. Like I'm on your team, like those kind of things like that, because he's okay with. So I'm not always going to assume that the other person was right when he tells me about an argument. I'm going to occupy a place from that he's right, and I'll coach him through it if he wasn't. But like I'm going to be on his team. My assumption is always that he is making good choices. I go in with that first, and then if it uncovers, that he wasn't, then we can coach and work through it. But I always want him to know that I believe in him, that he can make, like I've got confidence in his choices first. First, which I think was something that perhaps we didn't do in our generation. Like I always felt like if you got a bit of negative feedback from a teacher or whatever, your parent would be like, well, what did you do? Like it wasn't straight away assuming that you were okay or that there was other circumstances that didn't allow you to make a good choice. So I'm trying to flip that around very consciously, but not always easy. Not always easy when we've got people making consistently interesting choices at this age group.
Yeah, that's right. There's a lot of my conversations more like, what happened? So it's not like, what did you do? What happened? Or, tell me about it. And I say a lot too that like everybody sees it differently. This particularly in terms of sibling stuff as well. But yeah, people see it differently. So the teacher might have had one view, but how did you see it? Tell me that. So yeah, I think that it is really important because I guess it's like teenagers, ADHD teenagers are a bit more sensitive as well to that criticism. And so it's best to just try and take a step back and really make sure that what you're saying is not insinuating anything negative about them.
That beautiful question. Can you tell me what was going on for you in that moment? Can you tell me
that's right.
For you?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. You have shared so much incredible wisdom with us today. Now, I'd love for you to tell our audience where they can find you, how they can work with you, what sort of work, what sort of services you offer.
Yeah.
Because I know that this is an area that needs a lot of support.
Thank you for that. I've been sending people your way when they have young kids because I think you've got an awesome program available for parents. I have got a mini course, I would say, for parents at the moment called Supporting Your ADHD Teenager. and it's essentially what it says right there on the tin. But it's about, I think, understanding ADHD brains, but then also teenage brains, and how some of the strategies need to shift a little bit as we try and partner with our teenagers more in those years where they're preparing to be independent. So about the strategies that work for ADHD, like you've mentioned, but also how to collaboratively solve problems with your teenager and also help them to advocate for their own support at school. And so that's available all the time on my website, leannetran.com.au. I have a podcast as well, Parent Like a Psychologist, and or through my website, there's a newsletter parents can sign up for to keep, my goal, I guess, is to really provide education that parents need, because I think with that, then they have the ability to absolutely meet their own child's needs and be their best advocate. So it's just my job, I see it as, to provide the information.
Love that so much. Thank you so much for your time today.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me. It's always a great conversation with you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the ADHD Families Podcast. If you loved it, please share it on your socials. I want this to start a conversation about ADHD. If you want to make this mum do a little happy dance, please leave a review on iTunes. If you would like to know more about what we do, check out thefunctionalfamily.com. I truly hope that you enjoyed this podcast and you use it to create a wonderful, effective, joyful life with your beautiful children.